Welcome to the Transition District, a reorientation zone for high-agency individuals. Leverage our liminal architecture and dream validation framework.
Appendices, the post-corporate transition district. The now is beginning. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. May 30th, 2026. Appendix A. Glossary of doctrine terminology. Precise definitions of the governing vocabulary used throughout the handbook, organized to prevent the specific distortions that adjacent frameworks consistently introduce when their terminology is imported, without the specific operational precision that the governing framework requires. The activated district, a built environment that has moved beyond the liminal conditions productive suspension into the specific quality of genuine daily inhabitation by a community whose cultural production, social relationships, and operational practices constitute the district's living identity rather than merely occupying its physical spaces. Distinguished from the merely occupied district by the specific quality of the cultural density, the visibility of the community's intellectual and creative production in the district's public spaces, the quality of the social relationships between the district's inhabitants, and the specific atmospheric improvement that the community's genuine presence generates, that the activation produces and that the conventional leasing arrangement's occupancy does not produce. Atmospheric permission, the specific psychological condition that the liminal district's between-state atmosphere produces in the arriving transitioning professional. The felt sense that the in-between condition neither fully arrived at the new operating context nor fully departed from the old, is an acceptable condition rather than a failure state, and that the specific environment one has entered understands and mirrors that condition rather than expecting its immediate resolution. Atmospheric permission is the primary contribution of the eerie quality to the transition district's psychological function and the specific atmospheric resource most directly enabled by the liminal conditions productive suspension. The between space, the specific quality of the liminal district's physical and temporal condition. The district that has completed its first phase development without achieving the sustained activation of its intended program, producing the specific spatial reality of a built environment in suspension between the completed logic of the first phase and the undetermined logic of the second. The between space is not an absence, it is a specific presence, the specific presence of genuine potential unresolved into any particular form, which is both the source of the eerie quality and the source of the strategic availability that makes the between space the transition district model's most essential atmospheric precondition. The binding commitment, one of the guild model's 5 essential characteristics. The specific quality of the community member's relationship to the community's collective life that exceeds the voluntary, individually negotiated, individually revocable commitments of the network and the informal community. Distinguished from obligation enforced by institutional authority, the binding quality derives not from external enforcement but from the specific culture of mutual investment that makes the failure to honor the commitment a genuine violation of the trust the community has placed in the committing member. The binding commitment is the specific organizational condition that gives the guild model its specific quality of durable collective coherence across the individual pressures that consistently work against it. The conversion arc, the specific developmental trajectory through which an arriving uninitiated practitioner is converted, over the duration of their genuine engagement with the transition district's community and program, from a consumer of the community's cultural offerings into a contributing member whose presence generates genuine value for the community's ongoing life and cultural production. Organized around 5 sequential stages: the tentative offering, the discovery of consequence, the development of contribution identity, the consolidation of contribution practice, and the sovereign contribution. The conversion arc's consistent completion across successive generations of arriving practitioners is the primary mechanism of the community's recursive stability and the primary evidence of the transition district model's operational validity. Continuity multiplier, the specific operational role that the initiated practitioner performs in the community's guild model. The function through which the initiated practitioner's ongoing honest account, embodied demonstration, and creative inheritance contribution generates cultural continuity outcomes that exceed the linear contribution of the practitioner's own sustained membership by the specific multiplier of the number of developing practitioners whose conversion arcs the honest account has genuinely prepared, the number of cultural standards the embodied demonstration has genuinely maintained, and the number of mythological productions the creative inheritance has genuinely enriched. The continuity multipliers function is the primary mechanism through which the Guild model's knowledge transmission function converts the community's current generation of initiated practitioners' accumulated operational knowledge into the subsequent generation's developmental resource rather than allowing the knowledge to be lost with the departure of the generation that accumulated it. The creative inheritance, one of the three primary activities through which the initiated practitioner performs the continuity multipliers function. The specific engagement with the community's ongoing mythological production in the form of genuine creative contributions to the Super-Earth universe's narrative and world-building development, the community's NFP production, and the broader cultural production ecosystem, distinguished from the mere preservation of the community's existing mythological tradition. The creative inheritance is a living practice of ongoing creative contribution to the tradition's development rather than the custodial maintenance of the tradition's existing form. The creative inheritance's multiplier effect derives from the additive quality of the mythological production. Each genuine creative contribution increases the total body of the mythology's imaginative resources rather than depleting them, enriching the subsequent generation's creative engagement possibilities rather than restricting them. The Dreamcatcher Protocol, the specific operational instrument through which the dream validation framework's four concurrent processes, dream articulation, failure mode mapping, design modification, and operational testing, are organized into the coherent, trackable, community-supported validation process that the transitioning practitioner maintains throughout their engagement with the community's program. The protocol is not a questionnaire or a scored assessment. It is a living document, updated through the practitioner's ongoing engagement with the community's Friday reality stress tests and Thursday transition dinners and Tuesday publishing sessions, that tracks the specific modifications each iteration of the validation process has produced and the specific operational evidence that motivated each modification, described in full operational specification in Appendix B. Dream validation, the rigorous, community-embedded, operationally specific, longitudinally sustained process of determining whether a proposed life design can survive contact with the operational realities that the proposed design will encounter, and if it cannot survive in its current form, what specific modifications to what specific elements of the design would make survival possible without evacuating the desire that generated the design in the first place. Distinguished from dream affirmation, which provides the temporary amplification of the sense that a desire is valid and achievable without providing the operational grounding that genuine viability requires, by the four specific concurrent processes of the dream validation framework: the operational specificity of the dream articulation, the failure-inclusive honesty of the failure mode mapping, the iterative discipline of the design modification, and the real stakes evidence of the operational testing. The embodied demonstration, one of the three primary activities through which the initiated practitioner performs the continuity multipliers function. The ongoing quality of the initiated practitioner's daily practice that makes the community's cultural standards continuously visible and continuously available as reference points for the developing practitioner's own practice development, distinguished from the explicitly stated standard, which the didactic relationship of teacher to student provides, by the ambient, continuous, non-instructive quality of the embodied demonstrations mechanism, which operates through the observation faculty rather than the cognitive faculty and therefore produces the specific quality of genuine internalization rather than the intellectual acknowledgement that the explicitly stated standards reception typically produces. The eerie, the specific atmospheric quality of a built environment that was designed for a particular kind of human life but that is not presently inhabited at the density and the quality that the design anticipated, producing the specific felt sense of something absent that should be present, the life that was anticipated in the design and that has not fully materialized in it. Derived from Mark Fisher's elaboration of the concept in the context of cultural analysis. In the transition district's governing framework, the eerie is reframed as a strategic resource rather than a problem. The specific atmospheric quality most powerfully received by the arriving transitioning professional whose own interior condition mirrors the district's between state, producing the recognition that is the atmospheric reception phase's most important psychological contribution. The experimental accommodation model, the specific set of bounded, reversible, explicitly provisional agreements between the transition district's community and the development's property stakeholders that provide the spatial resource the program needs without requiring the full institutional commitment of the conventional leasing arrangement. Organized around four primary arrangement types: the pilot activation node, the rotating cultural occupation, the cultural residency partnership, and the event collaboration arrangement, each designed around the governing principle of maximum demonstration at minimum perceived risk. The model is experimental because its defining characteristic is the limited duration commitment that explicitly anticipates renewal based on the activation's demonstrated outcomes rather than the indefinite commitment of the conventional lease. The founding cohort, the specific group of practitioners whose convergence in the transition district during the seeding phase and the subsequent founding period constitutes the primary human resource from which the community's cultural identity, knowledge transmission infrastructure, and recursive stability mechanisms are initially built. Distinguished from a recruited founding team. The founding cohort is self-selected through the specific mechanism of the liminal district's atmospheric conditions and the governing vocabulary's intellectual attraction of the practitioners, whose own conditions most specifically parallel the district's condition and whose own intellectual and creative orientations are most specifically aligned with the governing framework's operational demands. The guild model, the specific organizational form, organized around 5 essential characteristics: territorial rootedness, generational continuity, binding commitment, quality governance, and mutual obligation, that the transition district's community employs as the primary mechanism for the systematic prevention of catastrophic knowledge loss and the sustained transmission of genuine operational capability across generations of practitioners. Distinguished from the professional association, the union, the network, and the academic community of practice by the specific combination of characteristics that makes the knowledge transmission function not merely a valued activity, but the primary organizational purpose for which the guild exists. Described without the medievalist romanticism and the platform-era appropriation that have corrupted the concept's contemporary deployment. The honest account. One of the 3 primary activities through which the initiated practitioner performs the continuity multipliers function. The specific, granular, failure-inclusive account of the initiated practitioner's own transition experience that makes the accumulated operational knowledge of the transition's genuine costs and genuine gifts available to the developing practitioner in the specific form most useful for preparing the developing practitioner's own encounter with comparable challenges. Distinguished from the informative account, which describes the transition's challenges from the retrospective position of the expert who already knows how the challenge is resolved, by the failure-inclusive character that gives the honest account its specific operational utility. The account that includes the specific financial stress at the specific month, the specific relational cost at the specific juncture, and the specific moment of genuine conviction that the transition was a mistake. Identity without architecture, the specific psychological condition produced by the dissolution of the institutional contract that was providing the professional social coordinates, temporal structure, performance feedback, community, and daily purpose. The condition in which the self is intact, the values, the capabilities, the ambitions, the aesthetic commitments are all present and functional, but the external structure through which all of these elements were organized into a coherent and socially legible presentation has been removed, leaving the self disorganized rather than destroyed, capable but contextless, productive but purposeless. Distinguished from burnout, which is produced by institutional overdemand, and from depression, which involves the diminishment of capability itself. Identity without architecture is the primary condition that the transition district's architecture of arrival is designed to address. The initiated practitioner. The practitioner who has already navigated some significant version of the post-institutional transition, who has passed through, in one form or another and with one degree or another of success and painful failure, the experience of operating outside the institutional framework that previously provided their social coordinates, temporal structure, performance feedback, community, and daily purpose, and who carries the accumulated operational knowledge of that experience as the community's most valuable resource for the knowledge transmission function. Distinguished not by the completion of the transition in the sense of having arrived at a fully stable sovereign practice. Many of the most valuable initiated practitioners are still in the middle of their own ongoing transition, but by the depth and the honesty of the experience that makes the knowledge accumulated through the experience genuinely useful to the developing practitioners who are earlier in the same process. Intellectual sovereignty, the specific quality of the sovereign publisher's relationship to their own intellectual and creative output. The condition in which the primary obligation is to the practitioner's own judgment, values, and intellectual commitments rather than to the institutional gatekeeper's standards, the platform's algorithmic preferences, or the market's demand for the content that maximizes engagement metrics, distinguished from mere independence, which is the condition of operating without institutional affiliation, by the specific positive practices of self-directed intellectual engagement, honest self-assessment of the work's quality against one's own genuine standards, and the consistent publication of what the practitioner's honest assessment identifies as most worth publishing rather than what the external validation systems would most readily reward. The institutional contract, voided, the specific legal and psychological formulation that describes the current condition of the professional employment relationship. Not the breach of a contract whose terms both parties remain committed to, which would be recoverable through renegotiation, but the voiding of a contract whose foundational conditions no longer exist. The institutional contract was voided when artificial intelligence dissolved the scarcity of sophisticated cognitive capability that gave the institution its structural reason to exchange the employed professional's time and capability for the identity architecture and social coordinates that constituted the contract's deepest product. A voided contract requires not renegotiation but the construction of an entirely different operating framework. The liminal architecture, the specific condition of a built environment poised between the completed logic of its first developmental phase and the undetermined logic of a successor phase that has not yet been identified or implemented. The architectural condition of genuine productive suspension that produces the specific atmospheric qualities, available meaning, atmospheric permission, productive incompleteness, that make the between-state environment the most appropriate and most effective container for the transition district's specific programmatic purposes. Distinguished from mere vacancy or decline by the specific quality of the genuine potential that the between-state preserves and that the resolved state, whether resolved through successful activation or confirmed decline, forecloses. The myth infrastructure, the full ensemble of the community's narrative self-understanding organized around the specific mythological register of the speculative rather than the retrospective. The super-Earth universe's ongoing world-building and narrative development, the founding narrative's articulation, the practitioner mythology's honest testimonies, the territorial mythology's stories of the community's relationship to its specific geographic environment, and the civilizational mythology's speculative explorations of the possible futures the transition's direction might produce. Distinguished from the governing vocabulary's intellectual framework, which addresses the rational faculty with conceptual precision, by the specific function of addressing the imaginative faculty with narrative resonance, producing the genuine inhabitation of the community's purposes that the rational endorsement produces only provisionally. The NFP, non-fungible publication, the transition district's primary cultural artifact, a physical publication produced by the community's sovereign publishers in a limited edition whose individual instances carry specific material qualities, weight, texture, design intelligence, the evidence of craft production, that give each instance a specific individual identity distinguishing it from every other instance of the same publication and from the identical reproduction of the mass market edition, distinguished from both the conventional book and the digital publication by the specific combination of physical permanence and design singularity that makes the NFP the most durable form of the intellectual territory's material anchor. Named in deliberate contrast to the NFT's digital non-fungibility, the NFP's non-fungibility is material and permanent rather than digital and platform-dependent. Narrative reactivation, the strategic use of narrative to produce a new interpretation of an existing built environment, to establish, in the minds of the relevant communities and audiences, a different understanding of what a place is, what it is for, and what kind of life it is available for, that precedes and enables the physical and programmatic changes that will eventually make the new interpretation concretely visible in the built environment itself. Distinguished from construction, which produces durable atmospheric change through physical intervention, by the specific mechanism of cultural authority. Narrative reactivation produces its outcomes through the establishment of the governing vocabulary's conceptual authority and the seeding phase's cultural demonstration rather than through the material transformation of the physical environment. Operational sovereignty, the condition in which a practitioner's primary obligations are to their own judgment, values, creative and intellectual commitments, and chosen community of sustained relationship, rather than to the institutional authority of an employer, a credentialing body, a platform's algorithmic preferences, or any other external system whose requirements must be met as a precondition for the practitioner's continued access to the economic and social resources their life requires, defined without romance. Not the condition of total independence from all external obligations, which is solipsism rather than sovereignty, but the condition of chosen obligation, the specific quality of self-governance that makes the obligations the practitioner carries the obligations they have chosen rather than the obligations that have been imposed on them as the price of access to their own livelihood. The pilot activation node, the specific experimental accommodation arrangement type most directly relevant to the development's vacant commercial spaces. A temporary agreement, with a defined duration of 3 to 6 months for the initial pilot, explicitly renewable upon mutual agreement following honest assessment, through which the property stakeholder makes a specific vacant commercial space available for the community's cultural programming at a below-market rent, reflecting the arrangement's experimental character, in exchange for the community's commitment to the specific quality and frequency of the cultural activation the arrangement's terms define. The post-corporate transition district. The specific institutional form that this handbook proposes and operationally specifies. A physical territory with its own metabolism, myth infrastructure, initiation culture, and production ecosystem specifically engineered to receive people in the condition of identity without architecture and return them, over time, as sovereign operators capable of designing and sustaining a life outside institutional scaffolding. Distinguished from the retreat, which provides temporary relief without permanent infrastructure, the co-working space, which provides work infrastructure without addressing the identity crisis, and the intentional community, which typically requires ideological conversion as a membership prerequisite, by the specific combination of territorial commitment, knowledge transmission infrastructure, dream validation process, weekly programmatic metabolism, and recursive stability mechanisms that make the genuine transition achievable rather than merely aspired to. The productive incompleteness, the specific spatial quality of the liminal districts between state, the condition of spaces built to a high physical standard that have not yet been fully furnished, programmed, and inhabited by the uses and communities that will eventually define them. Distinguished from mere emptiness, which is the absence of activation with no available potential, by the specific quality of the genuine potential that the between state preserves. The productive incompleteness is a spatial invitation. The invitation of the space that could become multiple things to the person who sees what it could become and has the vision and the will to participate in the determination of what it actually becomes. The quality governance, one of the Guild model's 5 essential characteristics. The community's maintenance of the specific standards of practice quality that distinguish the genuinely developed operational capability from the performed approximation of that capability. Distinguished from the exclusionary gatekeeping that the medieval guild's perversion of the quality governance function produced, which protected established practitioners from economic competition, by the specific positive function of maintaining the community's cultural standards of honest, rigorous, genuine operational capability against the specific social pressure of democratic inclusivity that consistently works toward the relaxation of those standards in the direction of the credential. Inflation that eventually hollows out the quality governance's genuine function. The recursive stability, the specific organizational property of a community whose ongoing operation continuously regenerates the conditions that make its continued operation possible, rather than depending on external institutional support for the maintenance of those conditions. Distinguished from institutional stability, which persists because external structures enforce the conditions of persistence, by the specific dynamic of the positive feedback loops whose productive quality amplifies across cycles of the community's operation. Organized around 4 primary feedback cycles in the transition district model: the knowledge accumulation and transmission cycle, the publication and recognition cycle, the atmospheric activation and stakeholder accommodation cycle, and the myth production and identity coherence cycle. The seeding phase, the specific period of informal, low capital, high visibility cultural activity that initiates the second phase's program before the stakeholder conversation, has produced the experimental accommodation model's formal agreements, generating the visible, documentable evidence of the second phase's operational reality that the stakeholder conversation requires as its primary instrument. Distinguished from the formal program, which operates within the dedicated spaces and the institutional structures that the experimental accommodation model's agreements provide, by the improvised, informal, self-organized quality that makes the seeding phase's cultural production more persuasive to the sophisticated stakeholder than the formal program's institutionally supported production, because the informal production is happening because the founding cohort's members genuinely cannot not do it. The social proof infrastructure, the specific body of accumulated, documented, honestly representative evidence of the community's genuine cultural activity that serves, in the transition district's second phase strategy, the specific structural functions of infrastructure, bearing the load of the strategy's most consequential claims, connecting the different components of the strategy's argument through the documented evidence that makes the connections legible, and providing the permanent foundation upon which the strategy's subsequent phases can build. Organized into 5 primary layers: the publication record, the attendance record, the atmospheric documentation, the media presence, and the practitioner testimony. The sovereign publisher, the practitioner whose publishing practice constitutes a genuine economic and cultural infrastructure rather than the incidental communication of a professional whose primary practice is something other than publishing. Distinguished from the writer who publishes, who produces content for publication as one among several professional activities, by the specific combination of the publishing infrastructure's development and maintenance, the audience relationship's genuine cultivation, the monetization architecture's honest construction, and the editorial identity's specific expression that constitute the sovereign publishing practice as a complete and self-sustaining professional form. The staged cognitive acclimatization, the specific framework for managing the uninitiated arrival's integration into the community's life. A deliberate sequence of 4 phases: atmospheric reception, contextual orientation, operational engagement, and sovereign contribution, each of which prepares the arriving practitioner for the subsequent phases' more demanding engagements by providing the specific experiences, relationships, and cognitive frameworks that make the subsequent demands accessible rather than overwhelming. Distinguished from the onboarding process, which introduces the new member to the community's features and norms in the format that maximizes continued engagement, by the specific developmental intent of each phase's design. The phases are not the community's management of the new member's introduction, but the community's genuine support of the new member's genuine developmental process. The Super-Earth universe, the shared speculative world that the Transition District's community is in the process of building through the Wednesday session's ongoing mythological production. A collaboratively constructed fictional universe in which there is no primary authorial authority and no secondary contributing participants, only co-creators whose collective engagement determines the universe's governing principles, characters, territories, and narrative directions. Distinguished from both the single-author fiction that the community admires and the franchise universe that the fan fiction tradition contributes to, the Super-Earth universe is specifically owned by the community that builds it, which means its intellectual territory is the community's intellectual property rather than the individual authors or the commercial franchises. The territorial identity, the specific quality of self-understanding that develops through the experience of being a genuine inhabitant of a place rather than a visitor to it or a user of its infrastructure. The condition in which the practitioner's sovereign practice is specifically adapted to and specifically dependent on the specific physical and social environment of the specific territory they have committed to inhabiting, and in which the territory's specific characters, its natural environment, its community relationships, its cultural productions, its historical associations, are constitutive of the practitioner's own identity rather than merely contextual to it. The Transition District, see the Post-Corporate Transition District. The uninitiated arrival, the practitioner who arrives at the Transition District in the earlier stages of their post-institutional transition, who has registered the dissolution of the institutional contract and recognized the inadequacy of the available conventional responses to that dissolution, and who has moved toward the district in search of the transition infrastructure that no conventional response provides, but who has not yet passed through sufficient experience of operating outside the institutional framework to have developed the specific operational knowledge and psychological resilience that the initiated practitioners carry. Distinguished from inferior arrivals, the uninitiated arrival's fresh signal, compressed ambition, and potential for genuine conversion are the community's most essential renewal resources, as important to the community's long-term health as the initiated practitioner's accumulated knowledge. The weekly metabolism, the 7-day rhythmic structure of the Transition District's programmatic life. Monday's cognitive synchronization, Tuesday's sovereign publishing production, Wednesday's mythological development, Thursday's honest knowledge transfer, Friday's operational honesty practice, Saturday's territorial activation, and Sunday's integrative rest. The metabolism is the organizational form through which the community's abstract governing framework is converted into the specific daily and weekly practices that constitute the community's genuine cultural life, and through which the recursive stability's 4 feedback cycles are continuously operated. Appendix B. The Dreamcatcher Protocol. Full operational specification. The complete validation framework, its phases, instruments, facilitators, outputs, failure modes, and the conditions under which a dream is validated as viable, modified toward viability, or deferred with the specific modifications required to make a future validation possible. I. The protocol's purpose and governing principle. The Dreamcatcher protocol is the operational instrument through which the dream validation framework's four concurrent processes, dream articulation, failure mode mapping, design modification, and operational testing, are organized into the specific, trackable, community-supported validation process that converts the transitioning practitioner's proposed life design from the aspiration that arrived with the practitioner into the specifically viable operational plan that the sovereign practice requires as its foundation. The protocol is maintained by the practitioner throughout their engagement with the community's program, updated through the ongoing engagement with the Friday reality stress tests and the Thursday transition dinners and the Tuesday publishing sessions, and made available to the community's practitioners and facilitators as the primary instrument for the community-supported guidance that the validation framework requires to be genuinely community-embedded rather than individually isolated. The governing principle of the Dreamcatcher protocol is the principle of honest iteration. The protocol's value is not in the accuracy of its initial entries, but in the honesty and the frequency of its updates as the validation process generates operational evidence that requires the proposed life design to be modified. The protocol that is never modified is the protocol whose owner is not genuinely engaging with the operational testing's evidence, is maintaining the initial proposed design in the face of the evidence that the operational testing is generating against it, which is the specific form of the premature termination of the validation process that produces the transition's most common and most costly failure mode. 2. The protocol's structure. The Dreamcatcher protocol is organized into four primary sections corresponding to the four concurrent processes of the dream validation framework, plus two supplementary sections that provide the temporal and community context that make the four primary sections' entries genuinely useful rather than merely informative. Section 1. Dream articulation. This section contains the practitioner's progressively refined operational description of the proposed life design. Progressively refined because the dream articulation process's discipline requires the description to descend from the aspirational level to the operational level through the specific iterations of the community's engaged questioning that make the operational specificity achievable. The section's primary entries are the aspirational description, the practitioner's initial articulation of the desired life, written in the practitioner's own authentic language without the operational discipline that the subsequent entries require. This entry is written once and preserved unchanged as the record of the aspiration's original form against which the protocol's subsequent development can be assessed. The operational description, current version. The practitioner's current most operationally specific description of the proposed life, including the specific Tuesday at 2 in the afternoon account, the specific economic architecture with specific revenue amounts and specific income streams, the specific community composition with specific relationship types, the specific territorial commitment with specific duration and specific material conditions, and the specific cultural production with specific publication forms and specific audience relationships. This entry is updated with each iteration of the validation process that produces a more operationally specific version of the proposed design. The operational gap assessment, the practitioner's honest identification of the specific elements of the aspirational description that have not yet been translated into the operational description with sufficient specificity to be validated. This entry identifies the specific work the dream articulation process still requires and provides the community's facilitators with the specific guidance on which elements of the proposed design most urgently require the community's engaged questioning. Section 2. Failure Mode Map. This section contains the community's accumulated mapping of the specific ways in which proposed life designs in the practitioner's specific domains most commonly fail to survive contact with operational reality. The section's primary entries are the domain failure mode inventory, the specific list of the failure modes that the community's initiated practitioners have identified through their own experience and their observation of comparable transitions as the most common points of breakdown in proposed life designs in the practitioner's primary operational domains. Each failure mode entry includes the failure mode specific description, the specific early warning signals that allow the failure mode to be identified before it reaches the point of irreversibility, the specific conditions under which the failure mode is most likely to manifest, and the specific modifications to the design that most effectively address the failure mode without eliminating the aspiration that generated the design. The practitioner-specific vulnerability assessment, the community's honest identification, developed through the Friday reality stress test and the Thursday dinner conversations, of the specific failure modes that the practitioner's specific proposed design is most vulnerable to given the specific combination of the design's current form and the practitioner's specific capabilities and specific psychological tendencies. This entry is updated with each iteration of the validation process that produces new evidence about the proposed design's specific vulnerability profile. The addressed failure modes record, the specific list of the failure modes that the design modification process has already addressed, with the specific modifications that were made and the specific evidence that the operational testing has generated about whether the modifications have been effective. This entry provides the ongoing record of the validation process's progress and the specific evidence base for the protocol's current assessment of the proposed design's viability. Section 3. Design Modification Log. This section contains the chronological record of the specific modifications that the validation process has produced in the proposed life design, with the specific operational evidence that motivated each modification. The section's primary entries are the modification entries, each modification to the proposed design recorded with the specific motivation for the modification, the specific failure mode identified, the specific operational evidence generated, the specific community assessment that recommended the modification, the specific content of the modification, what specifically was changed, what specifically was preserved, what specifically was deferred, and the specific expected consequence of the modification, what specifically. The modification is intended to address what specific evidence would demonstrate that the modification has been effective. The preserved core record, the specific elements of the aspirational description that the modification process has consistently preserved across all iterations, identifying the specific irreducible core of the aspiration that the design modifications discipline is protecting rather than accommodating. This entry is the primary instrument for preventing the design modification process from producing the specific failure mode of desire evacuation, the progressive modification of the proposed design toward operational viability at the cost of the genuine aspiration that generated the design in the first place. The deferred elements register, the specific elements of the aspirational description that the current validation process has identified as genuinely non-viable in the proposed design's current form, but that the practitioner and the community's honest assessment have identified as potentially viable in modified forms that the current stage of the validation process cannot yet specify. This entry identifies the specific work that subsequent iterations of the validation process will need to address and prevents the premature abandonment of genuinely achievable aspirations on the basis of the failure of their first operational formulation. Section 4. Operational Testing Record. This section contains the specific evidence generated by the community's operational testing of the proposed design's critical elements, the evidence that distinguishes the operationally validated claim from the theoretically coherent claim, and that makes the Friday reality stress test's honest assessment most specifically useful to the practitioner whose proposed design is being assessed. The testing activity log, the chronological record of the specific operational testing activities conducted. Each Tuesday publishing session's production contribution and its documented reception. Each Monday briefing's practical application of the week's AI landscape assessment to the proposed design's specific operational elements. Each Thursday dinner's honest account that directly addressed the proposed design's specific failure modes, and each element of the practitioner's own independent operational testing conducted in the specific conditions of the seeding phase's informal community. The evidence summary, the current state of the operational evidence, what the testing has confirmed about the proposed design's specific elements, what it has disconfirmed, what it has generated as new questions about the proposed design's viability that subsequent testing will need to address, and what it has revealed about the specific modifications to the design's specific elements that the evidence most urgently requires. The viability assessment, the community's current honest collective assessment of the proposed design's overall viability given the accumulated operational evidence. Whether the evidence currently supports the assessment that the proposed design is viable in its current form, requires specific modifications to achieve viability, or contains elements that the accumulated evidence identifies as genuinely non-viable in any currently conceivable form and that require the specific honest conversation about whether those elements represent the deferred aspiration that the deferred elements register addresses or the genuine non-viable aspiration that the honest abandonment the dream validation framework's ultimate function occasionally requires. Section 5. Timeline and Runway. The financial runway assessment, the honest documentation of the practitioner's current financial situation, the specific liquid reserves available, the specific monthly expenditure requirements, the specific runway duration these together produce, and the specific threshold, the minimum liquid reserve level below which the transition's continuation becomes financially untenable, that the protocol's financial planning identifies as the non-negotiable condition of the transition's sustainable continuation. The development timeline, the practitioner's current honest assessment of the specific time required for the proposed design's critical elements to reach the specific operational thresholds that the design's viability requires. The publishing practices subscriber threshold, the consulting practices client relationship threshold, the teaching practices enrollment threshold. This entry is updated with each iteration of the validation process that generates evidence about the actual development pace of the specific elements relative to the initially projected pace. The convergence assessment, the honest comparison of the runway duration and the development timeline. The specific probability, given the current evidence, that the proposed design's critical elements will reach their viability thresholds before the financial runway is depleted. This entry is the protocol's most immediately consequential single output, the specific honest assessment that determines whether the transition's continuation is financially sustainable in its current form and at its current pace or requires the specific financial architecture modifications that the DREAM validation framework's design modification process can address. Section 6. Community Facilitation Record. The Facilitator Log, the record of the community-specific engaged facilitation of the practitioner's Dreamcatcher protocol, which initiated practitioners have contributed to the failure mode mapping, which Friday reality stress tests have produced the specific assessments that the modification log records, which Thursday dinners have generated the honest accounts that the testing record documents. The open questions register, the specific questions that the validation process has generated but not yet resolved, identified as the primary agenda for the subsequent iterations of the validation process's community engagement. The validation status, the community's current honest collective assessment of the protocol's overall status. Whether the validation process is progressing at the pace and in the direction that the proposed design's genuine viability requires, or whether specific interventions, additional operational testing, specific community facilitation, financial architecture modifications, or the honest conversation about the deferred and non-viable elements are required before the validation process can proceed effectively toward its destination of the specifically viable proposed life design that the honest assessment identifies as genuinely achievable through the genuine practice of the specific operational plan the protocol has developed. 3. The protocol's facilitation. The Dreamcatcher protocol's effective operation requires the community's ongoing facilitation through the specific mechanisms that the weekly metabolism's programmatic elements provide. The Friday reality stress test is the protocol's primary institutional facilitation mechanism, the specific weekly context in which the protocol's current state is brought to the community's collective honest assessment, and the specific modifications that the assessment recommends are developed with the operational specificity the protocol requires. The Thursday dinner is the protocol's primary human facilitation mechanism, the specific weekly context in which the initiated practitioner's honest accounts of their own comparable experiences are made available to the practitioner's protocol development as the most directly relevant operational evidence for the failure mode mapping and the design modifications informed execution. And the Tuesday publishing session is the protocol's primary operational testing facilitation mechanism, the specific weekly context in which the practitioner's publishing practice's actual development generates the actual audience response data and the actual production sustainability evidence that the operational testing record documents. 4. The protocol's terminal conditions. The Dreamcatcher protocol's operation terminates under 3 specific conditions, each of which represents a specific form of the validation process's completion. The first terminal condition is the positive validation, the specific condition in which the protocol's operational testing record has generated sufficient evidence that the proposed design's critical elements are developing at the pace and in the form that the viability assessment identifies as adequate to the proposed design's genuine viability, and the community's honest collective assessment confirms that the evidence is sufficient to support the practitioner's transition from the validation process to the implementation of the validated design. The positive validation is not the claim that the validated design is guaranteed to succeed. It is the honest assessment that the design has been tested against the specific operational conditions it will encounter and has demonstrated, through the testing, the specific quality of genuine operational adequacy that makes the full implementation a rational commitment rather than a speculative gamble. The second terminal condition is the deferred validation, the specific condition in which the validation process has identified specific modifications to the proposed design that the practitioner's current operational situation does not make immediately achievable, financial architecture modifications that require the extension of the financial runway before implementation, capability development modifications that require the development of specific skills that the current validation process has identified as absent, or community formation modifications that require the cultivation of specific relationships that the current community engagement has not yet produced. The deferred validation is not a failure. It is the specific honest outcome of the validation process's honest assessment that the proposed design requires specific preconditions to be established before the validation process can proceed to the positive validation, and the protocol's deferred validation status provides the specific roadmap for establishing those preconditions. The third terminal condition is the honest abandonment. The specific condition, acknowledged with the operational honesty that the governing framework demands in every dimension of the community's cultural production, in which the validation process has generated sufficient evidence that a specific element of the proposed design is genuinely non-viable in any form that preserves the aspiration that generated it, and the practitioner and the community together have conducted the honest conversation that acknowledges the element's non-viability with the specific clarity that allows the practitioner to genuinely release the element rather than continuing to carry the weight of the aspiration whose operational impossibility the evidence has demonstrated. The honest abandonment is the hardest terminal condition to reach and the most important for the specific aspirations that the validation process's evidence has demonstrated are genuinely non-viable. The transition that continues to carry the non-viable aspiration is the transition most vulnerable to the valley's deepest failure mode, the collapse into the conviction that the entire transition was a mistake because the specific non-viable element's continued non-achievement is being experienced as the transition's overall failure rather than the specific element's honest impossibility. Appendix C. The activation sequence, phase by phase. The recommended order of operations for the first 18 months. What to build first, what to document, what to defer, when to approach property stakeholders, and how to manage the transition from informal seeding to formal district identity. Phase 1. Intellectual territorial capture, months 0 to 1. The first phase is the publication of the governing vocabulary, the establishment of the conceptual framework, the doctrine, the founding narrative, and the operational language that the transition district model requires as its primary intellectual instrument. This phase is complete before any physical activation has occurred, any stakeholder conversation has been initiated, or any formal community gathering has been organized. Primary actions. Publish the handbook's governing vocabulary in whatever distribution form is currently available: Substack, long-form social media, physical distribution to the founding cohort's members, with the specific emphasis on the weekly metabolism's operational specifications and the architecture of arrival's integration design, which are the elements most immediately relevant to the seeding phase's informal activities. Identify the founding cohort's core members, the 3 to 7 practitioners whose specific combination of operational knowledge, genuine territorial commitment, and intellectual alignment with the governing framework makes them the seeding phase's most essential participants. Establish the community's primary digital publication presence, the Substack newsletter, the social media channels, the multilingual publication infrastructure that the documentation discipline requires as its primary distribution mechanism. Conduct the founding cohort's first explicit alignment conversation, a Thursday dinner format gathering in which the governing vocabulary's primary concepts are discussed honestly against the specific operational realities of the founding cohort members' current situations, producing the specific quality of genuine collective understanding of what the community is attempting that the seeding phase's cultural production requires as its intellectual foundation. Documentation discipline begins. Every founding cohort gathering, every publication produced, every alignment conversation conducted is documented from phase 1's beginning. The documentation discipline's initiation before the seeding phase's formal activities begin establishes the honest chronological record that the social proof infrastructure's 5 layers require to demonstrate the community's genuine developmental trajectory rather than the curated presentation of selected highlights. Phase 2. Seeding, months 1 to 6. The seeding phase initiates the informal antecedents of the weekly metabolism's 7 programmatic elements in the spaces currently available to the founding cohort, generating the social proof infrastructure's 5 layers through the honest documentation of the genuine cultural activity the informal practice produces. Monthly milestones. Month 1. Initiate the Monday briefing's informal antecedent, the founding cohort's weekly gathering around the AI development landscape's most operationally significant developments, documented with photographs and brief written accounts published to the community's primary digital channels. Initiate the Thursday dinner's informal antecedent, the founding cohort's first deliberately structured shared meal, using the 4 governing themes as the conversation's organizing framework. Month 2. Initiate the Tuesday publishing session's informal antecedent, the founding cohort's first collective production session, resulting in the first publications to be distributed through the community's primary digital channels. The first NFP edition's production planning begins. Initiate the Wednesday session's informal antecedent, the founding cohort's first speculative fiction and world-building gathering, establishing the Super-Earth universe's first governing principles through the collaborative creative session. Month 3. Initiate the Friday stress test's informal antecedent, the founding cohort's first honest peer assessment session, in which each member presents their current Dreamcatcher protocol's status for the community's honest collective assessment. Initiate the Saturday Atmosphere Night's informal antecedent, the founding cohort's first public cultural gathering using whatever projection and display equipment is currently available, documented with the specific photographic and video documentation that the atmospheric documentation layer requires. Month 4. The founding cohort's informal weekly metabolism is now operating across all 7 days. This month's primary focus is the documentation quality's improvement, the specific development of the photography, the video production, the written account, and the metric tracking practices that the social proof infrastructure's 5 layers require to be genuinely persuasive to the stakeholder audience. Month 5. The first NFP edition's production and distribution. The first multilingual publications production, Spanish translation of the handbook's most immediately relevant chapter for the Latin American and Iberian communities, most directly relevant to the Tulum corridor's cultural context. The publication record's first significant expansion beyond the digital distribution channel's initial reach. Month 6. Seeding phase assessment. The founding cohort's honest collective evaluation of the social proof infrastructure's current state against the specific persuasiveness thresholds that the stakeholder conversation's target audiences require. The assessment determines whether the stakeholder conversation's initiation is supported by the current social proof or requires a further seeding period. Phase 3. First stakeholder conversations, months 6 to 9. The first stakeholder conversations are initiated with the specific stakeholders whose combination of social influence in the development ecosystem, genuine intellectual receptivity to the second phase program's concept, and current financial situation makes them the most productive first conversations for the visible success propagation principles application. Primary actions. Identify the influential early adopter, the specific stakeholder whose endorsement of the experimental accommodation model's first arrangement will most effectively enable the subsequent stakeholder conversation's more favorable reception. Prepare the stakeholder conversation materials, the social proof infrastructure's 5 layers organized in the specific formats and the specific narrative combinations that the influential early adopter's specific assessment logic requires for maximum persuasiveness. Conduct the first informal social proof presentation, not the formal pitch but the specific incidental encounter through which the social proof documentation is made visible to the influential early adopter through the specific social channels that the stakeholder's natural social environment provides. Conduct the first formal stakeholder conversation, the specific application of the governing vocabulary's language of the second evolutionary phase to the influential early adopter's specific situation, followed by the experimental accommodation model's first arrangement type proposal. Negotiate the first pilot activation node agreement, the specific terms that reflect the honest below-market calibration the founding period's financial constraints and the activation's specific current commercial value require. Phase 4. First formal activation, months 9 to 12. The first pilot activation node's operation converts the seeding phase's informal cultural production from the founding cohort's private cultural experience into the public cultural activation of a specific development space, generating the specific atmospheric documentation and attendance record evidence that the stakeholder conversation's expansion to subsequent stakeholders requires. Primary actions. Install the first pilot activation node's dedicated programming in the secured commercial space, converting the Monday briefing and the Tuesday publishing session and the Wednesday session and the Thursday dinner and the Friday stress test and the Saturday atmosphere night from the improvised informal contexts of the seeding phase to the specific dedicated space's more ambitious and more visible programmatic forms. Generate the atmospheric documentation's most persuasive evidence, the before and after photographs, the video documentation of the activated space's quality of human engagement, and the narrative accounts of the specific atmospheric improvement that the activation produces in the spaces immediately surrounding the pilot node. Expand the stakeholder conversation to the next target stakeholders, using the pilot node's operational evidence as the primary instrument. Produce the community's second NFP edition and the second multilingual publication, demonstrating the publication record's continued consistent development. Phase 5. Program Formalization, months 12 to 18. The program formalization converts the second phase's informal seeding and first formal activation into the explicitly institutionalized transition district program, whose governing vocabulary, operational specifications, and community identity are publicly established as the definitive form of the post-corporate transition district model's first instance. Primary actions. Formalize the weekly metabolism's 7 elements in the dedicated programmatic spaces that the expanded experimental accommodation arrangements now provide, with the specific design of each element's facilitation protocols, documentation standards, and quality governance mechanisms that the formal program requires. Establish the layered initiation's cultural architecture in its explicit form, the 4-layer specific threshold conditions, the explicit acknowledgement practices, the differentiated expectation norms, in the community's daily cultural life. Launch the global publication record's most ambitious phase, the comprehensive distribution of the handbook's governing vocabulary and the community's operational documentation through the multilingual publishing ecosystem's full range of channels. Conduct the first formal assessment of the recursive stability's 4 cycles initial operation, identifying the specific quality of each cycle's positive feedback and the specific governance interventions required to maintain the positive feedback against the specific failure modes each cycle's first 18 months of operation has produced. Appendix D. Stakeholder Conversation Scripts and Framing Guide. Sample language for the 4 primary stakeholder conversation contexts, with explicit annotations on the rhetorical function of each element and the alternatives that should be avoided. The landlord conversation. Opening frame. Establishing the shared perception of the current situation. I've been spending time in the district over the past several months, and I've been struck by the specific quality of the spatial infrastructure you've built here, the pedestrian grammar, the relationship to the jungle corridor, the material quality of the finishes. The ambition of the first phase is genuinely evident in the built fabric. What's also evident is that the district is in a strategic recalibration period. The original commercial activation thesis is developing on a longer arc than the initial projections anticipated. Note: strategic recalibration period establishes the shared perception without implying failure. Longer arc than initially anticipated acknowledges the underperformance without condemning the first phase's vision. The opening compliment is genuine, the spatial quality is genuinely impressive, and its genuineness is immediately perceptible to the stakeholder whose attachment to the first phase's vision makes the disingenuous compliment more damaging than no compliment at all. Transition to the reframe. What I've been observing, and what I think represents a genuinely significant opportunity for the district's second evolutionary phase, is that the conditions that make the conventional commercial activation thesis challenging right now are precisely the conditions that make a different form of activation unusually productive. The district's specific atmospheric quality, the specific relationship between the premium built environment and the incomplete activation, there's a specific class of arriving practitioner that finds that quality extraordinarily useful, and they're arriving in Tulum in increasing numbers. Note: second evolutionary phase is the governing vocabulary's primary reframe. Conditions that make conventional activation challenging are precisely the conditions that make different activation unusually productive, converts the liability into an asset without denying the liability's existence. A specific class of arriving practitioner introduces the target population without the ideological vocabulary that would trigger the stakeholders' defensive distancing. The proposal introduction. What I'd like to discuss is a specific pilot arrangement, a 3 to 6 month activation of one of the available commercial spaces, with a below-market rent that reflects the pilot's experimental character and the specific cultural programming we're committing to produce in the space. The commitment we're making in exchange is specific: a defined minimum number of programmatic sessions per week, a defined minimum attendance quality, and a documented atmospheric impact assessment at the end of the pilot period that gives you the specific evidence of what the activation produces in the immediate vicinity of the activated space. Note: pilot arrangement rather than lease. Experimental character explicitly acknowledges the arrangement's provisional quality rather than concealing it, which is more persuasive to the sophisticated stakeholder than the overconfident pitch. Below-market rent that reflects the pilot's experimental character frames the financial concession as the honest reflection of the arrangement's experimental nature, rather than as a bargaining position to be negotiated. 2. The Plaza Administrator Conversation. The Plaza Administrator Conversation addresses the master plan's collective governance, rather than the individual property owner's commercial assessment. The governing vocabulary's adaptation for this audience emphasizes the community benefit and the activation impact dimensions that the collective governance body's decision-making most directly weighs. Opening frame. The district has built something unusual, a pedestrian infrastructure of genuine quality in a geography that is almost entirely car-dependent. That spatial grammar is the district's most distinctive asset and the asset that is most directly relevant to what I'd like to discuss with you. Note: the Plaza Administrator's specific investment in the common space's quality is the most direct point of genuine alignment with the second phase program's cultural activation. Opening with the specific acknowledgement of the common space's quality establishes the genuine alignment before the proposal is introduced. The community benefit framing. What we're proposing for the common areas is a series of cultural activation events, projection events, exhibition installations, cultural gatherings, that use the pedestrian corridors and the plaza spaces as the primary activation surfaces. The specific outcome we're committing to is the documented improvement in the ambient quality of those spaces during and immediately following the activation events. The specific foot traffic quality, the specific social interaction quality, the specific visible evidence of the cultural density that makes the pedestrian infrastructure feel genuinely inhabited rather than merely constructed. Note: cultural activation events, rather than parties or markets, or any of the conventional event categories that the Plaza Administrator's experience has made legible but insufficient as descriptions of the second phase program's specific cultural character. Documented improvement in the ambient quality establishes the social proof generation as the community's explicit commitment rather than the implicit aspiration. 3. The Master Planning Stakeholder Briefing. The Master Planning Stakeholder Briefing addresses the development's strategic governance, the specific institutional entity responsible for the development's overall identity and long-term positioning. The governing vocabulary's adaptation for this audience emphasizes the global recognition and the category-defining distinction dimensions that the master planning stakeholder's strategic responsibility makes most directly relevant. The global positioning argument. The Riviera Maya is saturated with premium lifestyle developments. The category is genuinely competitive and the differentiation pressure is real. What is not saturated, what is, in fact, entirely unclaimed as a development category, is the post-professional transition district, the premium built environment that has positioned itself as the specific destination for the global professional class that is navigating the fundamental restructuring of knowledge work that the AI development wave is producing. That's a large and growing market, and it is a market that no other development in the corridor is currently addressing. Note: post-professional transition district, rather than post-corporate transition district. Post-professional is more legible to the master planning stakeholders' market positioning vocabulary and less ideologically charged than post-corporate. The global market argument is honest. The market is genuinely large and genuinely unclaimed, and its honesty is more persuasive than the inflated claim would be. 4. The media framing. The media framing adapts the governing vocabulary for the specific audiences of the media channels most relevant to the global recognition strategy's target communities. The AI development and future of work press, the sovereign publishing and creator economy press, the luxury travel and destination press, and the cultural and intellectual publications that address the post-institutional aspirations most sophisticated practitioners. For the AI and future of work press. The first district explicitly designed as transition infrastructure for the professionals being displaced by the AI development wave. Not a retreat, not a co-working space, but a full programmatic ecosystem that addresses the identity, economic, and community infrastructure that the post-institutional transition genuinely requires. For the sovereign publishing press. The first territorial community whose primary cultural production infrastructure is organized around the sovereign publishing practice. The specific combination of physical NFP production, multilingual publishing, and AI-assisted production workflow that constitutes the post-institutional practitioner's primary economic and cultural architecture. 4. The luxury destination press. Aldea Zamares' second evolutionary phase positions the district as the global destination for the specific class of high-agency professionals seeking the specific combination of premium-built environment, genuine intellectual community, and operational transition support that no other destination currently provides. Appendix E, the weekly programming calendar. First season. A fully populated 13-week calendar covering the first season of the Transition District's formal programming, with specific session topics, documentation milestones, and the indicators that signal whether the metabolism is producing cultural density or merely activity. Weeks 1 to 2. Establishment. Monday, AI Frontier Briefing topic. The current state of the AI displacement wave across the primary professional domains represented in the founding cohort. Facilitator, the founding cohort's most technically informed member. Documentation. Photograph. Brief written account published to primary digital channels. Tuesday, Sovereign Publishing Session, Production Focus. Each founding cohort member produces one publishable piece for their primary publication platform. Review Focus, the governing vocabulary's intellectual framework applied to the founding cohort's existing publications. Infrastructure Workshop, platform selection and audience development strategy for each practitioner's current publishing situation. Wednesday, Parallel Civilization Night Session Type, World Building. Focus. The Super-Earth universe's governing principles. The specific physical, social, technological, and cultural parameters that the universe's collaborative construction requires to be collectively determined before the narrative production can proceed coherently. Output. The universe's first governing document. Thursday, Transition Dinner, Table Composition. All founding cohort members plus 1 or 2 practitioners from the district's broader community. Governing themes introduced. Financial reality and identity dissolution. Documentation. Attendance record. Brief, honest account of the dinner's most operationally valuable exchanges. Anonymized. Friday, Reality Stress Test. Presenter. 1 founding cohort member. Format. Full operational brief. Clarification exchange. Honest assessment. Constructive synthesis. Documentation. The presenter's Dreamcatcher protocol updated with the session's specific findings. Saturday, Atmosphere Night. Format. Informal seating phase version. Projection of the Super-Earth universe's first governing document's key visual elements onto available surfaces. NFP display of the community's first publications. Live publishing dispatch by at least 2 founding cohort members. Sunday, Integration. Optional cenote visit organized for interested community members. No formal programming. Weeks 3 to 4. Deepening. Monday, AI Frontier Briefing topic. The specific AI tools most directly relevant to the founding cohort's primary sovereign practice domains. Practitioner Roundtable introduced for the first time. Each founding cohort member presents one specific operational decision they have made in their practice in response to the preceding week's AI developments. Tuesday, Sovereign Publishing Session, Production Focus. Each founding cohort member produces their second piece, with the publication review's honest collective assessment applied to the first piece's actual audience response data. Infrastructure Workshop. The NFP production process. The specific design, printing, and distribution practices that the community's physical publication requires. Wednesday, Parallel Civilization Night, Session Type, Character Development. Focus. The Super-Earth universe's primary characters. The initiated practitioner, the uninitiated arrival, the property stakeholder in the universe's imagined transition district scenario, the governing practitioner. Output. Character studies for each primary character type. Thursday, Transition Dinner. Governing themes introduced. Relational cost and unexpected gift. Documentation. Attendance record updated. The session's most operationally useful honest accounts added to the community's failure mode knowledge base. Anonymized. Friday, Reality stress test. Presenter. Second founding cohort member. The first session's constructive synthesis outcomes reviewed. Has the first presenter implemented the recommended modifications? What has the implementation produced? Saturday. Atmosphere night. First external documentation invitation. One photographer or filmmaker from the broader community invited to document the gathering with the specific photographic quality the atmospheric documentation layer requires. Weeks 5 to 8. Consolidation. The consolidation period's focus is the development of the social proof infrastructure's 5 layers toward the specific persuasiveness thresholds that the first stakeholder conversation requires. Each week's programming continues the established patterns of the establishment and deepening periods, with the following specific additions. Week 5. The first Spanish language content produced. The translation of the Monday briefing's most operationally significant finding into Spanish for distribution to the Spanish language communities most directly relevant to the Tulum corridor's geographic and cultural context. Week 6. The first NFP edition's physical distribution, hand-delivered to the specific property stakeholders, local cultural figures, and broader community members whose receipt of the physical publication constitutes the first social proof layer's most persuasive physical evidence. Week 7. The first external media mention solicited. A brief account of the community's cultural activities submitted to one of the AI and Future of Work publications most directly relevant to the global recognition strategy's primary media targets. Week 8. The social proof infrastructure's honest internal assessment. The founding cohort's collective evaluation of each layer's current state against the stakeholder conversation's specific persuasiveness thresholds. The assessment determines the timing of the first formal stakeholder conversation. Weeks 9 to 11. First stakeholder engagement. Week 9. The influential early adopter identification and the first informal social proof presentation. Not the formal pitch, but the specific incidental encounter through which the documentation is made visible through the stakeholder's natural social environment. Week 10. The first formal stakeholder conversation, conducted with the governing vocabulary's full deployment and the social proof infrastructure's 5 layers organized in the specific presentation formats the influential early adopters assessment logic requires. Week 11. The pilot activation node negotiation, the specific terms discussion that produces the founding period's first experimental accommodation agreement. Weeks 12 to 13. First formal activation. Week 12. The pilot activation node's first week of operation in the dedicated commercial space. The formal transition from the seeding phase's improvised contexts to the activated space's more ambitious programmatic forms. The documentation discipline's highest priority week. The before and after atmospheric documentation. The first dedicated space Monday briefing's photographic and written documentation. And the first Saturday atmosphere night in the dedicated space's atmospheric enhancement. Week 13. The first season's honest collective assessment, the founding cohort's evaluation of the 13 weeks operation against the specific indicators of genuine cultural density rather than mere activity, the quality and consistency of the Thursday dinner's honest accounts, the quality and consistency of the Tuesday session's production outputs, the quality and consistency of the social proof infrastructure's documentation, and the specific evidence of the conversion arc's operation in the 1 or 2 members of the broader community who have moved from the arriving practitioner layer toward the developing practitioner layer across the season's duration. Quality indicators. The metabolism is producing cultural density rather than merely activity when the following specific indicators are present. The Thursday dinners are genuinely honest, not pleasantly interesting, genuinely honest, producing the specific quality of discomfort that the honest account of genuine difficulty reliably produces in both the giver and the receiver. The Tuesday sessions are genuinely producing, not working toward eventual publication, actually publishing, actual pieces reaching actual audiences and generating actual response data that the publication review's honest assessment can engage with. The Friday stress tests are genuinely uncomfortable, not productively challenging. Genuinely uncomfortable, producing the specific quality of the practitioner's encounter with the genuine inadequacies of their proposed design that the operational honesty culture requires. The Wednesday sessions are genuinely building, not entertainingly creative. Genuinely building, producing the Super-Earth universe's narrative and world-building material with the specific quality of collaborative investment that distinguishes the genuine creative inheritance from the entertaining creative exercise. The Dreamcatcher protocols are genuinely evolving, not being maintained. Genuinely evolving, being modified through the honest engagement with the operational testing's evidence in the specific ways that genuine iterative validation produces. Appendix F. The Sovereign Publishing Stack. The full technical and editorial architecture of the district's publishing infrastructure. From first post to sustainable independent publication, specified in sufficient detail to be executable by the first cohort of practitioners without external consulting. The stack's governing philosophy. The Sovereign Publishing Stack is not a technology stack. It is not the specific combination of software tools and platform services that a technology stack describes. It is the specific combination of editorial practices, economic architectures, platform relationships, physical production capabilities, and audience development disciplines that together constitute the sovereign publisher's complete publishing infrastructure. The technology tools are components of the stack, but they are not the stack's primary definition. The primary definition is the governing philosophy that organizes the technology tools deployment in the service of the specific editorial and economic objectives that the sovereign publishing practice requires. The governing philosophy is the philosophy of genuine independence. The specific combination of platform diversification, physical publication anchoring, multilingual reach development, and direct audience relationship cultivation that makes the sovereign publisher's practice genuinely independent of any single platform's continued operation, any single algorithm's continued favor, and any single market's continued demand. The genuinely independent publishing practice is the practice that could survive the termination of any single component of the stack without the practice's overall continuity being threatened, because no single component is so load-bearing that its removal would collapse the entire structure. 2. The stack's primary components. Component 1. The primary digital platform. The primary digital platform is the sovereign publisher's primary digital distribution channel, the specific platform through which the majority of the digital audience accesses the publication. The governing framework's recommendation for the primary digital platform is Substack, for the specific combination of reasons that the Tuesday Publishing Sessions Infrastructure Workshop has identified as most relevant to the sovereign publisher's specific requirements. The direct subscriber relationship that makes the audience's continued access to the publication independent of the platform's algorithmic distribution, the monetization architecture that allows the subscriber relationship to generate direct economic return without the platform's intermediation, and the specific quality of the Substack community that makes the platform's ecosystem a genuinely useful network for the sovereign publisher's audience development rather than the extractive attention economy that the social media platform's equivalent communities represent. Setup requirements. A Substack newsletter with a specific editorial identity statement, the specific description of what the publication covers, for whom, and with what specific quality of engagement that the editorial identity requires, published in the newsletter's About section and updated with each significant evolution of the editorial focus that the practitioner's developing sovereign practice produces. The editorial identity statement is the publication's primary instrument of audience self-selection, the specific text that allows the reader who is genuinely the publication's intended audience to identify themselves as such and to commit to the subscriber relationship that the direct audience relationship requires. Cadence. The minimum viable cadence for the Substack newsletter's development as a genuine audience relationship rather than an occasional publication is one substantive issue per week. Substantive meaning the specific quality of intellectual or creative engagement with the publication's specific editorial focus that the subscriber has committed to the subscription relationship in expectation of receiving. The minimum viable cadence is the Tuesday session's primary production commitment. One publishable piece per week, produced in the Tuesday session's production sprint and distributed through the Substack platform before the following Monday's briefing. Component 2. The physical publication anchor. The physical publication anchor is the sovereign publisher's NFP production practice, the specific quarterly or semi-annual production of the physical publication edition that gives the digital publication its most durable and most culturally authoritative material form. The physical publication anchor's governing requirement is the design quality. The NFP must be produced with the specific combination of material quality and design intelligence that gives the physical artifact the specific atmospheric authority of the premium cultural object rather than the mass-market commodity. This requirement is not primarily aesthetic, it is strategic. The physical publication's authority in the stakeholder conversation and the global recognition strategy is directly proportional to the physical qualities specific evidence of the community's serious cultural commitment. Setup requirements. The specific printing and production relationships that the physical publication requires, the local printer whose production capabilities and quality standards meet the NFP's design requirements, the paper supplier whose materials provide the specific weight and texture the governing philosophy requires, and the design practitioner whose visual intelligence the publication's design quality requires. The founding cohort's first priority in the Tuesday session's infrastructure workshop is the identification and cultivation of these specific production relationships. Because the NFP's first edition is the social proof infrastructure's most immediately persuasive single document, and the production quality's failure in the first edition is the most difficult recovery in the stakeholder conversation's entire sequence. Component 3. The multilingual extension. The multilingual extension is the sovereign publisher's deliberate development of the publication's reach into the specific language communities most relevant to the transition district's global recognition strategy. The governing framework's recommendation for the multilingual extension's primary priority is the Spanish language extension. The specific development of the publication's presence in the Spanish language intellectual communities of the Latin American and Iberian worlds that constitute the Tulum corridor's most immediately relevant international audience and the most directly accessible first multilingual market for the Aldea Zama community's publications. Setup requirements. The specific translation practice that the multilingual extension requires, not the machine translation that AI tools make immediately available and that the governing framework explicitly cautions against as the primary multilingual extension strategy, because the machine translation's specific quality of fluency without genuine cultural intelligence produces publications that are legible in the target language without being genuinely credible in the target cultural context. The governing framework's recommendation is the AI-assisted human translation practice. The human translator whose specific cultural intelligence in the target language community provides the genuine credibility that the machine translation lacks, supported by the AI tool's specific capabilities for the initial translation draft and the terminology consistency management that the multilingual extension's volume of translation work requires. Component 4. The distribution network. The distribution network is the specific combination of the direct subscriber relationship, the social media amplification channels, the cross-publication referral relationships, and the physical distribution channels through which the publication reaches the audiences that the direct subscriber relationship does not yet encompass. The distribution network's development is the most resource-intensive and the most time-dependent component of the sovereign publishing stack. It cannot be built quickly, because the genuine audience relationship that the distribution network is designed to scale requires the specific quality of sustained, consistent, genuinely valuable publication that accumulates over time rather than the viral distribution event that acquires large audiences quickly and loses them equally quickly when the viral moment's specific conditions cease to obtain. Development sequence. The distribution network's development follows the specific sequence of the publication record's quality accumulation. The first 6 months of consistent, genuinely valuable publication establish the quality record that the cross-publication referral relationships require as their primary validation. The first year's consistent quality record establishes the social media community's organic advocacy that the social amplification channels require as their authentic distribution mechanism, and the second year's documented impact on the specific practitioners whose transitions the publication has specifically served establishes the practitioner testimony layer that the stakeholder conversation and the global recognition strategy require as their most humanly persuasive evidence. Component 5. The monetization architecture. The monetization architecture is the specific combination of revenue streams that the sovereign publisher's economic sovereignty requires to be diversified enough that no single stream's contraction produces a financially critical reduction in the total revenue. The governing framework's minimum viable monetization architecture for the sovereign publisher is the 3-stream architecture. The subscription revenue stream, the Substack paid subscription, the NFP subscription, or the equivalent direct audience relationship that generates recurring subscription income. The service revenue stream, the consulting, the coaching, the workshop, or the equivalent service offering that the sovereign publisher's accumulated operational knowledge makes available as a direct economic product, and the platform revenue stream, the speaking fee, the course enrollment, the affiliate relationship, or the equivalent platform-mediated revenue that extends the subscription and service stream's reach into the audiences that the direct relationship does not encompass. The minimum viable economic architecture's specific threshold requirements. no single stream constituting more than 40% of the total monthly revenue, the combined 3 streams average monthly total meeting or exceeding the practitioner's specific monthly expenditure requirements by a minimum of 20%. The 20% surplus is the monthly addition to the financial reserve that the 12-month liquid reserve requirement necessitates, and the stack's overall architecture being demonstrably functional, producing the specific financial outputs that the architecture's design targets, within the 24 to 36-month development window that the governing framework's honest assessment of the sovereign economic architecture's realistic development timeline establishes as the adequate expectation. Component 6. The editorial identity. The editorial identity is the specific combination of the publication's thematic focus, its intellectual register, its relationship to the governing vocabulary's primary concepts, and its specific aesthetic character that distinguishes the sovereign publisher's publication from the vast quantity of content produced in the same thematic domain without the same quality of genuine intellectual and operational engagement. The editorial identity is not a brand. It is the specific honest expression of what the sovereign publisher most genuinely cares about and is most genuinely qualified to address, developed through the consistent practice of the Tuesday session's output-first culture and refined through the honest collective assessment of the publication review's honest engagement with the actual audience's actual response. The editorial identity's development requires the specific courage of genuine specificity. The editorial identity that is genuinely specific, that addresses the specific intersection of the practitioner's specific operational knowledge and the governing vocabulary's specific conceptual framework and the specific audience's specific current challenges, is the editorial identity that produces the specific quality of genuine reader recognition that makes the subscription relationship a genuine commitment rather than a provisional experiment. The editorial identity that is generic, that addresses the broadly relevant themes of the post-institutional transition without the specific operational grounding and the specific intellectual particularity that genuine specificity requires, is the editorial identity that produces the specific quality of general appreciation that makes the subscription relationship a passive consumption relationship that terminates when the algorithm stops serving the content and the reader stops actively seeking it. The Sovereign Doctrine series, Handbook I, is complete. Aldea Zama can become the first globally recognized post-corporate transition district. The governing vocabulary is established. The intellectual territory is claimed. The operational framework is specified. The mythological infrastructure is founded. The stakeholder conversation is prepared. The guild model is designed. The civilizational argument is made. The beginning is now. Pirate first for MXTM's newsletter.
Welcome to the Post-Corporate Transition District in Aldea Zama Tulum. This isn't just a retreat, it's a realignment. District, a reorientation zone for high-agency individuals. Leverage our liminal architecture and dream validation framework.
The cage is unlocked, but we choose the bars. Renting our lives, forgetting the source. We are the sovereign authors of this digital verse. Reclaim the dowry, break the curse.
This is the doctrine. The post-platform era demands sovereign authorship. Build the stack, own
The sovereign authorship dowry. Doctrine for the post-platform era.
NFPs are here, signed, priced, split, and anchored to a living page. And
this isn't just a token, it's ownership, not access. It's time to take back the real world.
The non-fungible print, NFP. Paper strikes back.
TM Studios, Sovereign Residency and Cultural Partnership Proposal.
Age of the Apes.
the 1%. A post-scarcity transition doctrine.
Gone bad.
A post-scarcity secession doctrine.
Silicon Privateer 2026.
The conversation around AI has officially moved past can it write an email to when does it take the corner office?
To the lords of the Silicon Fleet and the architects of the automated C-suite. I see you've traded your captains for calculators. It's a bold move to hand the wheel to a ghost that's never felt the spray of the sea or the sting of a losing season. You're betting everything on efficiency, but you've forgotten one thing. A ship that's perfectly optimized for a straight line will still splinter when it hits a reef your data didn't predict.
Part 8, the Post-Corporate Transition District. The Civilizational Argument. MXTM aka Pirate 1 or VJ Tsunami X. May 29, 2026. Part 8, the Civilizational Argument Chapter 38. What globally recognized actually means. The phrase global recognition is one of the most abused designations in the contemporary vocabulary of institutional ambition. Having been applied with such promiscuous generosity to such a vast range of organizations, initiatives, programs, brands, and cultural projects that have achieved varying and frequently modest degrees of actual global awareness, that the phrase has largely lost its capacity to communicate anything more specific than the institution's aspiration to be taken seriously by audiences beyond its immediate geographic vicinity. The conference that describes itself as globally recognized because its proceedings are downloadable from a website accessible in multiple countries. The co-working space that describes itself as globally recognized because its Instagram account has followers on 4 continents. The intentional community that describes itself as globally recognized because a profile in a medium circulation lifestyle magazine reached some readers who do not live in the community's immediate vicinity. These are not instances of global recognition in any operationally meaningful sense. They are instances of the aspiration to global recognition expressed through the self-application of the designation that the aspiration is directed toward, in the specific cultural dynamic through which the designation's inflationary deployment eventually strips it of the precise meaning that makes it strategically valuable to the communities whose genuine achievement of the condition it was originally designed to describe. This handbook is making a specific and precise claim to global recognition for the Aldea Zama Transition District, a claim that is not the aspirational self-application of a desired designation but the specific description of a specific condition that the second phase strategy is designed to produce through the specific mechanisms that the preceding parts of the handbook have established in operational detail. The precision of the claim requires the precision of the definition, the specific delineation of what global recognition means in the specific context of the Transition District civilizational project, and what it does not mean, and why the distinction between the genuine condition and its aspirational approximations is consequential rather than merely semantic for the strategic purposes the global recognition is designed to serve.